imagine that if we were to enter into any one of our houses of worship on any given Friday or Saturday or Sunday or any other day of the week for that matter, we would sit at the feet of any one of the faith leaders who we are honored to host this evening, and we would hear words of text and words of faith to guide and inspire us. In Jewish tradition, we turn each week to a passage from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, for our initial inspiration. And this week, we begin reading from the book of Exodus, in Hebrew, Shemot, names. It begins with the litany, a list of names. And we are introduced, as we heard, to Moses, a man of humility and a man of conviction. And it seems beshert, it's a Jewish term for something that is meant to be, a coincidence that happens exactly the way God intended. It seems beshert that we are reading about Moses in this particular moment when we welcome tonight's speaker. Cornell William Brooks, Reverend Cornell William Brooks, is Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also Director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership and visiting professor of the practice of prophetic religion and public leadership at Harvard Divinity School. He is a former president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He is a civil rights attorney and an ordained minister. He was most recently visiting professor of social ethics, law, and justice movements at Boston University School of Law and School of Theology. He was a visiting fellow and director of the campaign and advocacy program at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics in 2017. Reverend Brooks served as the 18th president of the NAACP from 2014 to 2017. Under his leadership, the NAACP secured 12 significant legal victories, including laying the groundwork for the first statewide legal challenge to prison-based gerrymandering. He also reinvigorated the activist social justice heritage of the NAACP, dramatically increasing membership, particularly online and among millennials. Among the many demonstrations from Ferguson to Flint during his tenure, he conceived and led America's Journey for Justice march from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., over 40 days and 1,000 miles. Rabbi Lustig, our Rabbi Emeritus, Cantor Bortnick, Rabbi Michael Namath, and I were privileged, along with many of you, and honored to participate and to celebrate the culmination of the journey on this very bima in September of 2015. Reverend Brooks has spent his lifetime fighting for social justice and civil rights wherever inequity exists, particularly in the areas of criminal justice reform and fair housing, to name just a few. Reverend Brooks holds a JD from Yale Law School, where he was a senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and member of the Yale Law and Policy Review, and a Master of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology, where he was a Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar. He earned a BA from Jackson State University and is a recipient of several honorary degrees and several honorary doctorates, including Boston University, Drexel University, St. Peter's University, and Payne Theological Seminary, as well as the highest alumni awards from Boston University and Boston University School of Theology. And Reverend Brooks is a 4th-generation ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Beyond the achievements, the accolades, and awards, Reverend Cornell William Brooks is simply a mensch. He is a voice of conscience and compassion, a voice of urgency and justice. He continues to march beside us as a sacred partner, an ally, and a Moses of our day. I'm thrilled to welcome back to Washington Hebrew Congregation Reverend Cornell William Brooks as he addresses the question of where we go from here.
Good evening. As I stand on this bema tonight, I'm surprised that it can bear the weight of my gratitude and appreciation for a congregation that after 40 days and 1,000 miles of marching beside Baptists and Methodists, but also Jewish adults and children and people from this congregation from Selma to the nation's capital, to be here this many years later with Rabbi Sue Shankman, the rabbinical leadership of this congregation, the cantors, the leadership of this synagogue, this ecumenical interfaith collection and constellation of leaders is more than my heart can bear. And so I simply say to you the words that my grandmother, Miss Rosalie Prelo, taught me to say at the beginning of every sermon, of every speech, of every talk. Those words would be these: thank you. We find ourselves on this warm, wintry evening within the welcome embrace of this Washington Hebrew congregation. We find ourselves under the leadership of Rabbi Sue Shankman, who with you have extended your arms of welcome to not only those who are Reform or Reconstructionist or Orthodox or Conservative, but also those who are Baptists and Methodists, Protestant and Catholic, Hindu and Sikh, Muslim and Buddhist, and yea, even those who are skeptical and doubtful in their faith. We find ourselves in this sacred place, this holy place, this consecrated place, this set-aside place. We find ourselves in this sacred place not endeavoring to celebrate a federal holiday, but rather to observe a sacred Sabbath of social justice, so much so that this Washington Hebrew congregation yet calls it a Martin Luther King Shabbat. We find ourselves in this sacred place. And yet I understand that Reform Judaism is not an evangelical affair. And yet this congregation thought it not robbery to extend a hand of welcome and invitation across the length and breadth of this, the nation's capital, to laity and leaders of various faith traditions to come and celebrate and commemorate and to mark and to lift up the life and legacy, words and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so I can only greet you with words that yet resonate and reverberate down the corridors of time, words that have been lifted up, words that have been taught to little Jewish children, and those words would be these: Shabbat Shalom. Across the ceremonial arc of this Martin Luther King weekend, there will be those who celebrate Martin Luther King as a civil rights leader, a Nobel laureate, a political figure, one whose blood sacrifice made the Civil Rights Act possible, made the Voting Rights Act possible, and because of his death, within days of his death, made the Fair Housing Act possible. And if we're honest with ourselves, his sacrifice, his literal sacrifice of his life made the opportunities of our children, all of our children, possible. And so we are here celebrating a civil rights figure. There are those who will celebrate Dr. King as a moral philosopher, a social ethicist, one steeped in the moral philosophical tradition of Boston personalism. But can I tell you that Dr. King, as great a philosopher as he was, benefited from a theological gift that comes by way of Judaism. It's called the Imago Dei, the notion that every child, every boy, every girl, every child of this congregation and all of our congregations, all of our mosques, all of our temples are made in the image of God and as such have inestimable worth and value. That was a core value, a foundational belief of his philosophy. And so there are those who will celebrate Dr. King as a moral philosopher or a social ethicist. There are those who will celebrate Dr. King as an orator, someone whose silver similes and golden metaphors yet illumine our moral imagination, whose rhetorical excursions in history and sociology and political science yet prick and prompt our conscience even in this day. And yet, I want to call on this Washington Hebrew congregation and our sister congregations to contemplate, to morally imagine Dr. King as a father, as a daddy, as a papa, as a parent. You recall that Dr. King lifted up words that are all too familiar, so much so that there are those who quote and misquote him. There are those who appropriate and misappropriate his words. Those words were lifted up on an August afternoon on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Those words would be these: I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation in which they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Dr. King, as a daddy, as a father, as a papa. Certainly there is somewhere across the expanse of this congregation a Jewish mother who is struggling with how to explain to your son, or to your daughter, to your child, how they can be reduced to an anti-Semitic stereotype. Certainly somewhere across the expanse of this congregation, there's a Muslim daddy, a Muslim mother who stammers and stutters when they contemplate the fact that their child may be subject to a hate crime. Somewhere in this congregation, there may be a Sikh mother, a Hindu father, who yet wrestles with how do I hold sacred? How do I protect the self-worth, the dignity, the value of my child in a world ridden with hate? And perhaps there's a black mother, black father, black parent who finds themselves suddenly and inexplicably inarticulate when they have to give their child the talk, particularly their boys the talk. And the talk concerns not the birds and the bees, but rather the police. Explaining to your son that a young black man is 21 times more likely to lose their lives at the hands of the police than their white counterpart. Perhaps there's someone in this congregation tonight who's contemplating the life and legacy, words and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King as a parent. And if that's not true, perhaps one of the beatifically beautiful children who graced us with their voices tonight Perhaps they wonder, what does Dr. King have to say to me in 6th grade, in 7th grade, in 8th grade, in the 9th grade, in the 10th grade, the 11th grade, or perhaps in the 12th grade? What does Dr. King have to say to my generation in this moment? And so I just call upon you this evening to take a look at a pericope, a portion of Scripture found in the book of Kings. And in the book of Kings, we find these words round about the 16th verse. And the word of the Lord reads thusly: Now 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my Lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened the 3rd day after I'd given birth that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. No one was with us in the house, except the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she rose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant slept, and laid him on her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was, dead. But when I had examined him in the morning, indeed, he was not my son whom I had born. Then the other woman said, No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. And the first woman said, No, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king Solomon. And the king said, The one says, This is my son, who lives, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, No, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. Then the king said, Bring me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in 2, and give half to one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, Oh, my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him. So the king answered and said, Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment of which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. In this story, we encounter a boy king, a little older, or perhaps the same age as the children who sang in this Martin Luther King choir. This boy king asked God, not for riches, not for a long life, but rather for wisdom, for understanding, that he might lead his people. And so this boy king, this Solomon, is then given an initial test of his wisdom. He's confronted with 2 women who are arguing over a child, a living child. It was a custodial battle. Without DNA, without any eyewitnesses, and lawyers among us will tell you that the way this case is presented to Solomon is not unlike American jurisprudence. The plaintiff puts forth her claim. The judge repeats back the claim. The judge hears testimony, weighs evidence. These two women were undoubtedly marginalized by the male-oriented patriarchal society. They are called in the text, or some texts, harlots, prostitutes. Scholars differ, rabbis differ, ministers differ as to what were their vocations. Some claim that they were prostitutes. Some claim that they were widows. Others claim that they were spirits. But what is incontestably true is that they were mothers. We have two mothers who go before the king, one of whom has lost their child in an act of negligence or perhaps oversight. And they're arguing, they're debating as to whose child is alive. Solomon calls for a sword. Now let us note he called for a sword. Some scholars pose the question, why didn't he call for a rope or some other implement of death that might administer a death penalty to a child more slowly? Solomon calls for a sword, and he proposes that the child be divided in two. One eye, one set of limbs, or one hand or foot. Solomon calls for an implement of death. This seems like a vulgar display of jurisprudence. Solomon proposes that the baby be split in two. But note, one mother immediately calls out, do not kill the child. Give the living child to the other woman. Here's the first lesson of this text with respect to Dr. King. Let us note that the evidence of moral fitness, or the fitness to be a mother, was sacrificial love, which is to say that one mother was willing to sacrifice custody of her child in order that her child might live. Let us know this, that this mother responded with such moral speed, such ethical ferocity. She exclaims, she says, do not kill this child. It's the demonstration of her sacrificial love that qualifies her to be a mother. She does it so quickly, we are led to believe that had any child been threatened, had any child been imperiled, had any child been endangered, she would have spoken up. Let's think about Dr. King. I know we are not used to thinking about Dr. King with maternal metaphors, but I need y'all to work with me tonight. You see, because Dr. King, amidst his many well-noted and well-cited sermons and essays and speeches, in the middle of that American epistle called Letter from the Birmingham Jail is a description of Dr. King stuttering and stammering, trying to explain to his baby girl, his firstborn child, Yolanda, that she couldn't go to a local amusement park called Funtown. He notices that his daughter, his child, his girl is ethically confused and morally befuddled. He finds himself inarticulate, trying to explain the inanity, the irrationality of American racism. This little gem buried in the middle, the letter from a Birmingham jail, suggests to us that Dr. King's children occupied a prominent place in his moral imagination. I want to suggest to you tonight that our concern for our children and other people's children has everything to do with whether or not we're qualified to lead. Oh, I can tell this is not entirely clear. May I make this personal? You see, I don't need for my sons to be Jewish, to be concerned about Jewish children being stereotyped. I don't have to have my children scapegoated. I don't have to have my children have their loyalty called into question in order to be concerned. I have to be concerned about your children as much as I'm concerned about my children. Why is this important? You see, because unless we demonstrate a sacrificial love for all of our children, we're not qualified to lead. Oh, I know that we like to talk about allyship. And allyship is morally important, morally consequential. But can I tell you, how far does allyship go when somebody else's child is in peril? When somebody else's child is being demeaned? When somebody else's child is being degraded? When somebody else's child's, their self-worth is being called into question? How much of a problem is it when the problem is occurring in your house and not my house? Well, we got quiet in here. You see, allyship only goes so far. But when we lay moral claim to other people's children, it radically upsets our moral priorities. You see, when you see black boys pushed up against a wall, patted down, having their dignity, their privacy, and the sanctity of their bodies invaded by the police, your child may not be black, your child may not be African American, but that's your child. Or when I see a Muslim girl being belittled, being demeaned because her hair is covered in modesty as a crown of her faith. Though I don't have daughters, though I don't have girls in my nuclear family, I have to be concerned about that. I have to be worried about that. I have to give that moral priority. Because unless all of us are free, none of us are free. We have two women in a custody fight. One is willing to literally sacrifice a child's life with the understanding, if I can't have mine, you can't have yours. How many of us are that way about our rights, our communities? If I can't be treated respectfully, if I can't be treated with dignity, if I can't have my personhood respected, I'm not going to worry about your personhood, not going to worry about your dignity, not going to worry about your worth, not going to be worried about your rights. Allyship doesn't go that far. Oh, I can tell. May I make this a little bit more clear? When we did that march from Selma to Washington, D.C., Washington Hebrew congregation, to the best of my knowledge, not the entirety of your membership, perhaps not the majority of your membership, are obvious victims of voter suppression. But I understood your rabbis, your cantors, your members to have a stake in this issue because it was about everybody's rights, not just your rights. And I have to tell you this evening that when you go through the works of Dr. King over and over again, he lifts up the notion of the Imago Dei. The fact that all of our children are literally created in the image of God and as such have value and worth. He learned that from the Boston personalists at Boston University School of Theology. But the first people to make that claim, the first people to make that theological assertion were not moral philosophers at Boston University School of Theology. There were a group of Israelites wandering around in the wilderness who had a God who reminded them that they were somebody, though they were treated as nobody. That comes from your book. And Dr. King laid claim. He theologically laid claim to this notion. Why? Because when you're concerned about everybody's children, that will take you into some dangerous places. Think about the Children's Crusade. Dr. King calls on children to be arrested, calls on children to expose their bodies to violence, calls on children to literally sacrifice their lives for the cause of freedom. He didn't do so because he undervalued the present and past of our children. It's because he valued the present and future of our children. And so there was a sense of moral urgency to his work. So when we think about our children literally being in peril, it gives our work urgency. It means we don't get to things when we get to things. We make up our mind to take up the cause of justice. Now, this is critically important because we have so many, not this congregation, but there are other congregations. We have to have 10 committee meetings. We have to pass 5 resolutions. We need to call the rabbi in for consultation. We need to consult the leadership before we decide to stand on the side of right. Well, I can't speak about the Muslims, can't speak about the Sikhs, can't speak about the Buddhists, but I can certainly speak about the Methodists. We had that challenge. We want to deliberate. But Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us over and over and over again that deliberation can be the death of decisive justice making. In this text, Solomon is lifted up and lauded for his wisdom. But what about the sacrificial commitment of a mother? It's good for men to be wise, but it's important for men to be loving. It's important for men to be intelligent, to be lifted up, to be exalted and respected for the ways in which they render decisions. But it's important for us to demonstrate through the eloquence of our example, love. Why? Because we understand that in God's moral vocabulary, love is a verb. It's an action word. And in this text, we have a woman who was willing to give everything in order to save her child. This many years later, across this weekend, we will hear any number of politicians who will invoke Dr. King's words with respect to his 4 little children. But I'm asking the question, what about the children of this congregation? What about the children in the mosque down the street, the temple around the corner, the church across town? What about our children in this time? What civil rights battles do we have to fight? What social justice campaigns do we have to create? What change do we make in this moment? Oh, I know we have some of a certain vintage who will say, I did mine. I led when I could lead. I marched when I could march. So I've decided to outsource the social justice revolution to the next generation. I've decided to exercise some generational delegation. But can I tell you, when your children are out in the streets, the best place for you to be is out in the streets. May I make this a little personal? My son, after George Floyd was killed, the youngest one, he and a group of his high school classmates called for a march. They did not consult the NAACP. They did not consult the Urban League. Did not consult the august committees of this congregation. They simply called for a march on social media. 900 to 1,000 people show up at the White House. They then say to me, well, your daddy, said to my son, your daddy's a civil rights lawyer. He was supposed to be head of the NAACP. Can he come down here and say something? So I go down to the White House, and there are all of these young people. I'm asking where are the marshals, who's organizing, who's in control, what's the supply line? Where's the resolution? Who has decided to do what? Who's in charge? And they said to me, Dad, we're in charge. What do you mean we are in charge? I need to see who's the lead person, who's the CEO, who's the rabbi, who's the preacher, who's the imam. I said, no, we don't organize that way. But it occurred to me that the best way for me to teach would be to listen. The best way for me to serve would be to stand in support. Our children in this moment need us. Our children in this moment are looking for our sacrificial commitments. And that goes way beyond what we officially decide to do. It also comes down to what we unofficially model. The way we pray with our children. The way we stand beside our children. The way we respect other people's children, love other people's children, serve other people's children. The way we engage other people's children. One of the most heartening things I have ever been a moral eyewitness to is to come into this congregation and to see people of all ethnicities, of all races, and all faiths worshiping together. What kind of a witness, what kind of example are you setting for your children, not just for this generation, but for the generation to come? You have no idea of the moral implications and ramifications of your example setting. You recall that Dr. Martin Luther King, in the midst of all of his moral and prophetic busyness, when a young junior in high school, 17 years of age, by the name of John Lewis, writes him a letter about segregation in his high school. Dr. King takes the time to answer that letter, and another letter, and another letter, and to send that young man a bus ticket to come to Montgomery. How many of us have the opportunity to write this generation one letter, and another letter, and another letter, and send them a bus ticket to join our social justice revolution? That's the moment we're in. It's an exciting moment. It's an exhilarating moment. It's a life-changing moment. It is your children's moment, and it is our moment. And so in answer to the interrogative, where do we go from here? We go with our children. We go with our children, with them occupying a prominent place in our moral imagination. We go with our children into other communities, into other houses of faith, into other social justice battles. We go beyond allyship. So when we have difficult conversations about Kanye and Kyrie, we have difficult conversations about Israel and Palestine. We have difficult conversations about this generation and the next generation. We show up. We don't abandon our children because their politics on our politics. If there's one thing I've learned as a professor, I used to think I was right. But I came to appreciate the fact that we've got to invest in our youth. And lastly, I want to remind you that Dr. King did not emerge as a fully formed prophetic figure in America's moral imagination. You recall he went to college at the age of 15, only a little older than Solomon. You recall he came under the tutelage of Benjamin E. Mays, the president of Morehouse College. You recall that Bayard Rustin served as a nonviolent mentor to Dr. King. You recall that Howard Thurman served as a moral, philosophical, mystic mentor to Dr. King. Everybody needs mentors. Everybody needs support. Everybody needs a moral mama, a moral daddy, a moral papa, a moral mother. And everybody needs a mother like the mother found in the book of Kings. Somebody who will risk their life to protect your life, who will literally give the whole of their lives to ensure that you have a life. So on this Martin Luther King holiday, we're reminded that Dr. King had a dream for his children, but he also had a dream for our children. And it is up to us to pass that dream to them. Amen.